Hello students and welcome to the lecture of MEG 8 New Literatures in English, Block 2 A Grain of Wheat by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. I am Dr. Madhumita Chakraborty from Zakir Hussain Delhi College Evening, University of Delhi. So in our previous class we had talked about the rise of the modern novel in Africa, and before that we had also mentioned the Kenyan situation and the circumstances under which Ngugi wa Thiong'o was writing. So today's class or today's lecture we will begin with the history of colonization in Kenya. As we know that, we've talked about this earlier, that the Arabs came and then the Portuguese came and then the British came. So we know that the covert colonization of Kenyan people really actually then began at the end of the 19th century after the conference, Berlin Conference. And after that there was the granting of a royal charter for trade to the Imperial East African Trading Company within the bounds of what was then known as the East Africa Protectorate. This annexation, however, became much more overt and much more formal when the company withdrew for financial reasons and the British government took over the control of the territory in its own hands. And once the British government took over the control, it appointed a commissioner for the protectorate. Now this situation is similar to what the British had done in other places where they colonized, where they initially went in as traders. We've seen the situation in India also, where they initially came in as the East India Company and then gradually the British government took over. The same thing happens here in Kenya. Resistance, however, in Kenya began almost immediately. Initially in the form of isolated incidents, there were small groups of people, there would be scattered protests, but obviously these kind of scattered small scale protests did not have a lot of impact because they were not organized, there was no proper planning, there was a lack of perspective, there was lack of coordination among various sections of the society who were all kind of doing their own thing. So then the government's decision to bring in foreign settlers from Europe, from Asia, from South Africa further complicated the situation. And as a result, the freedom struggle for Kenyans was both a long one as well as a bitter one. So it continued like this till about the late 1940s, early 1950s, when this whole struggle became violent, and this also coincided with the rise of the Mau Maus in Kenya. Kenya, and this is a quote which I am saying, and I quote, Kenya under colonial rule, unlike the average colony in West Africa, was plagued with settler problems. Consequently, the liberation struggle in Kenya was bound to be one of the most dramatic in the history of the continent. End quote. This is a quote from the text Not Yet Uhuru. By the 1950s, the Kenyans began to become impatient. There was this constant suffering, constant humiliation that they were facing from both sides. Who were the both sides? At one level, of course, the colonizers were there. And at the other level, these settler populations which had come in from abroad, like as I just said, from Asia, from South Africa, these settler populations were also subjugating the local Kenyan population. There was constant humiliation, which became too much for the Kenyans to withstand. So as written in the book Mau Mau from Within, and I quote here, the freedom movement was the result of the ills of colonization affecting almost all tribes in Kenya. Their lands were taken away from them by the Europeans, their education cut, their freedom curtailed through forced labor, their wages made miserably low, and their pride and dignity trampled through disallowance of observance of tribal customs and rituals, and finally through the practice of the obnoxious Kalaba. So, this code basically sums up the various levels at which the problems were being faced. The most important was land. For poor people, for natives, land is what sustains them. It brings them their livelihood, it brings them their bread and butter. And here the settlers, they had taken over the majority of the good cultivable land, they had taken over all the precious resources, and the natives had been banished to the reserves and they had no resources at their disposal. Their freedom was curtailed. They had to work as slave labor in the plantations, in the grounds of the settler people. Their wages were low, their pride, their dignity, everything was absolutely thrashed by them. So, by this time, by the 1950s, the Kenyans had had enough, and the resistance to the colonial movement takes on a different aspect. In 1951, there were some demands, small scale demands that were made by the locals. But as expected, these were rejected by the colonizers. So, one of the main reasons for this pelting and penting up anger against the British as a result of their policy of taking over the most fertile land from the Africans, as I just mentioned, and giving it to the Europeans to cultivate. And this led to a chronic shortage of land in the African reserves. Consequently, thousands of young, unemployed youth were forced to work on European farms at miserably low wages and appalling conditions. So, as more and more Africans became educated, they realized the injustice that was happening to them. They realized that the colonizers who had come in with all these promises were actually, only pandering to the Eurocentric idea of civilizing the savages, the white man's burden, which we have mentioned in our previous lectures. The social and the economic grievance therefore became very intensified. It grew in scale as more and more Africans began to understand that the social system was not immutable, that the social system could be changed. Moreover, thousands of Kenyan soldiers who had recently returned from war duties abroad had travelled widely and they had seen the Europeans. This is the 1950s, so this is just after the Second World War. So, they had seen Europeans at close quarters in their own home grounds. And meanwhile, of course, in 1947, the recent independence of India from British rule also began to inspire many Kenyans who began to think that if one country could do it, others could also follow suit, and gaining independence was not at all impossible. So, this resistance, we have seen that now that they decided that there was going to be resistance, and this resistance was going to be militant. So, the patronizing attitude, how did it manifest itself? It manifests itself against the patronizing attitude of the clergy, who, though professing Christian brotherhood, actually regarded African Christians as inferior beings. So, there is also the white Christian and the black Christian, and the black Christian is inferior to the white Christian. So, even though it is the same religion, it is obviously a religion that does not treat all members of its faith in the same way. The second way that this resistance manifests itself was through strikes by trade unions, who were now clamoring for more rights, who were now clamoring for better working conditions. So, a note by the Deputy Governor to the Secretary of State for the colonies in 1945 states, and I quote, "The principal item in the natural resources of Kenya is the land, and in this term we include the colony's mineral resources. It seems to us that our major objective must clearly be the preservation and the wise use of this most important asset. So this brought an offensive from the settlers and the government in the form of what they called the Kenya Plan. As the details of the notorious move to convert Kenya into white man's country became known in 1949, the radicals among the Kenyans, whose political awareness had been steadily increasing over the years, they decided to launch a final battle, a more of a do or die battle for the liberation of Kenya, accepting the alternative of violence, fully realizing that violence would have its own repercussions and it would bring in more suffering for the population. So once militancy was decided as the way forward, the first step was to ensure mass support for those who had gone underground to fight as militants. This was achieved through the administration of an oath to the groups of people. The moment the government came to know about the administration of this oath, it came down very heavily, not only on those who were involved in it, but also on a large number of innocent people. The harsh and brutal measures taken by the government to stop the oath, however, proved to be counterproductive, because more and more people, especially the young, were impatient for change and they took the oath. So now we come to the Mau Mau rebellion. So the word Mau Mau, it's a very interesting word. Where does it come from? And till date, there is no clear picture from where we get this word, because the word Mau Mau has no meaning either in Gikuyu or in Swahili, but there are a lot of interesting speculations about its origins. Some people have suggested that the expression was arrived through a transposition of the word Uma Uma. Uma Uma means out out in Gikuyu, which refer to the desire of the Africans that the Europeans leave Kenya. Another explanation offered is that a witness in the Naivasha trial used the expression mumu mumu mumu, referring to the whispered voices at oath ceremonies. And this was misheard by the journalists who were present there as Mau Mau. And they reported like that in their stories, and that was how the word came into being. Another explanation for this word is the Gikuyu word muma, meaning oath, which was used by a witness at the Naivasha trial and which a police officer was unable to pronounce or spell correctly. And this police officer therefore created his own pronunciation of the word, which was Mau Mau. So we see that, that this word really doesn't have, the etymology of the word is unknown, but the word Mau Mau caught on, and since then this rebellion, this uprising that was there by the local population, militant uprising, is known as the Mau Mau rebellion. The Mau Mau rebellion was a revolt against colonial rule in Kenya, and it lasted from 1952 through 1960, and it helped to hasten Kenya's independence. During this 8-year revolt, around 32 white settlers and about 200 British police and army officers were killed. 1,800 African civilians were killed, and although there is no clarity about the number of Mau Mau rebels who lost their lives, an estimate puts that figure at around 20,000. So we can see how a large number of local youth who joined up for the Mau Mau rebellion lost their lives in it. As the movement grew in strength, simultaneous with the most repressive measures used against Kenyans at large and the Gikuyu community in particular, the British government let loose the most foul propaganda to paint the entire movement in black. So they did everything they could to discredit this movement. So this propaganda machinery of the government swung into action. So one person who was involved in this was Mr. L.B.S. Leakey. He wrote a piece called Defeating Mau Mau. And in this, it was a totally colonizer viewpoint, a totally one-sided viewpoint, a totally distorted picture of Kenyan reality. And what does he say? And listen to the words carefully as I quote, "The noble white man who fervently engaged in bringing civilization, Christianity, education, and the good life to Kenya's backward natives was suddenly forced to defend self and property, law and order, peace and morality against the treacherous attack of atavistic savages gone mad with a bloodlust." Just look at the terms which I am repeating, some of the words here: noble, bringing civilization, good life, treacherous attack, atavistic savages, bloodlust. We can see that how biased this viewpoint was, and the agenda of this viewpoint, which was to totally disregard this Mau Mau struggle and the independence movement. As this movement progressed, a Swahili backronym was adopted, which was Muzungu aende Ulaya, Mwafrika apate uhuru. Muzungu aende Ulaya, Mwafrika apate uhuru, which means let the foreigner go back abroad, let the African regain independence. Uhuru was the Kenyan word for independence. J.M. Kariuki was an important member of the Mau Mau rebellion. He was detained during the conflict, and he suggests that the British preferred to use the term Mau Mau instead of the KLFA to deny the Mau Mau rebellion any kind of international legitimacy. Similarly, author and activist Wangari Maathai indicates that to her, the most interesting story of the origin of the name is the Kikuyu phrase for the beginning of a list. So when beginning a list in Kikuyu, one says, Maundi ni Mau, the main issues are. Maundi ni Mau, the main issues are, and holds up 3 fingers to introduce them. Maathai says that the 3 main issues for the Mau Mau were land, freedom, and self-governance. So, very different, very varied perspectives on the origin of the name, but what is absolutely clear is that the focus of this Mau Mau rebellion was to undertake a militant struggle to enable Kenya to finally gain independence. So, I mentioned in one of my previous lectures that in response to this Mau Mau rebellion, the government announced emergency in October 1952. During the emergency alone, some 10,000 Africans were killed by the security forces, and over 80,000 were detained in various camps and subjected to indescribable brutalities. No detainee was released until he had been passed along a security clearance known as the pipeline. And we will talk a little bit more about the pipeline when we discuss the grain of wheat. Among the emergency casualties not recorded are the victims of this pipeline who were injured and permanently disabled through torture to extract confessions for them. So during the emergency, as we can see, all these people were put into detention camps, and the Manyani was perhaps the largest and the most notorious of these detention camps. Kariuki, who I've just talked about, he was himself a detainee at this Manyani camp, and he writes, Manyani, and that's a quote, the largest camp capable of holding up to 30,000 of us is now a word deeply entrenched in the language of every tribe in Kenya, and no one hopes to understand the present temper of Kenya African politics without some awareness of the life led by our 80,000 detainees during those emergency years. The conditions in the reserves where the native population used to stay were no better either, where the chiefs, the home guards, and other such henchmen ruled the roost with the help of local administration authorities. Remember, the colonizers can not succeed if they do not have any kind of assistance from the locals. There are always this category of locals who are looking out for their individual aggrandizement, individual advantage, and who help the colonizers in their deeds. So, the similar thing was happening in Kenya. However, despite all their efforts, all their sophisticated weapons and all their war machinery, the British government could not crush the freedom movement. Fighting against heavy odds of scarce resources, lack of training, and against superior forces, the guerrillas covered themselves with glory by continuing the struggle for more than 4 years, which earned them universal acclaim. So, after the emergency was lifted in 1957, the process of the British gradually devolving more powers to the locals was started. As part of this process, a constitutional conference was called in London in 1960. This was the first of 3 conferences which were held, and in each of these conferences more and more power was devolved to the local population till the last conference in 1963. So, the first conference was held in 1960, the second was held in 1962, and the third was held in 1963, which talked about total independence to Kenya. These conferences were held in London. The Prime Minister Harold Macmillan was leading the discussions, and he was in favor of giving total independence to Kenya, and he was therefore not very popular amongst the local British population. So, the first conference, which was held in 1960, decided to give the Africans majority seats in the Legislative Council. So, this was 33 seats out of the total number of 65 seats. In addition, they decided that the Africans would have the largest number of ministers. So, the Africans would have 4 ministers, the Europeans would have 3 ministers, and there would be 1 Asian minister. So, obviously, you can see that the Europeans are outnumbered here, 4 Africans and 1 Asian. So, the Europeans are outnumbered 5:3, and they were not happy with this plan. They dubbed it as a victory for the Mau Mau and attacked the British volte-face. On the other hand, the locals were obviously very happy as the European domination had been broken, or at least in 1960, the process to break this European domination had been started. So, after the British dominion had been broken, the local Africans were very happy because finally they were beginning to get a glimpse of independence. They could see a light at the end of the tunnel. A new mass organization called the Kenya African National Union, or the KANU, incorporating the members of the KAU, which we had discussed in a previous lecture, was formed in March 1960. This had Kenyatta as its president, and again we've already discussed about Kenyatta in a previous lecture. Soon, however, there was a split in the KANU and another party was formed, which was the Kenya Africa Democratic Union, the KADU, and this was formed with the aim of opposing the KANU. In the 1961 elections, the first elections which were held, the KANU dominated the KADU, and in June 1963, soon after Kenya got its uhuru or its independence, Jomo Kenyatta became Kenya's first Prime Minister. So finally, on December 12th, 1963, Kenya gained its much awaited uhuru or independence. A grain of wheat is set against this background, and in the next video we will talk more about the grain of wheat. But so before we go on, let's just quickly summarize what we have done in this video today. So this video basically was intended to provide us with a idea of the background, the socio-political context in which the grain of wheat is going to be written. So we have undertaken a historiographical journey starting with the beginning of colonization of Kenya, which we have already mentioned earlier also, but here we focused on the end of the 19th century, the charter, the gradual imposition of the British, the coming of the settlers, and how this impacted the local population. We talked about the militant phase, which started in the 1950s, which was as a result of building up unhappiness, building frustrations within the local people who realized the kind of injustice that was being done to them. We've discussed about how this resistance manifested itself, how they realized that there was, even within Christianity, there was a high Christianity and a low Christianity, so to speak. How the Kenya plan came abroad, how the people, were asked to take oaths, they went underground, they took oaths, and how the government resisted it. We've discussed about the Mau Mau rebellion, which is a very, very important event in Kenyan history and which actually foregrounds a lot of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's writings. We've talked about how the onset of the emergency and how the impact that had on Kenya. And finally, we have now wound up the socio-political historical context of Kenya. We've talked about the modern novel in Africa. We've talked about the linkages between literature and society, literature and politics, and all of these that we have discussed so far in the 4 lectures are now going to come together as we begin our discussions on Ngugi wa Thiong'o's A Grain of Wheat in the subsequent lecture. So I hope this socio-political historical context has now been clear to you, and now we will take this forward and begin our discussions on the grain of wheat in the subsequent videos. Thank you for your attention.